Moving into a new home is always accompanied by excitement and a bit of anxiety. You're starting a new life, forming new relationships with neighbors, and setting new rules for your existence. When we decided to have a barbecue to celebrate the move, I had no idea what it would turn into. So there I was, standing by the grill, gearing up for a peaceful evening with family, when I noticed her, the neighbor. A middle-aged white woman with a face that could only be described with one word: displeasure. She was standing on her porch, staring at us as if we were a personal affront to her peaceful life. I tried to ignore it because, damn it, it's our right to enjoy an evening in our new home. But her gaze was filled with such hatred that I felt anger boiling inside me. I could hear her muttering something under her breath, and suddenly it dawned on me what she was doing. A phone. She was calling the police. I watched her lips move, forming accusations, suspicious people, disturbing the peace. Who was she to dictate to me how to live? I tried to convince myself that it was just a trifle, that everything would be fine. But when you face such blatant hostility, it's hard to remain indifferent. Something tightened inside me. This wasn't just a complaint. It was an assault on our freedom, on our right to be here. The police arrived faster than I expected. 2 patrol cars pulled up in front of our house, and 2 officers got out. I braced myself for the worst. Another round of questioning, asking what we were doing, why we were here. But they didn't even look our way. Instead, they headed straight for her. I froze. What were they going to do? All I could expect was a check of our IDs or a warning. But when the officers approached the neighbor, everything happened so quickly that I didn't have time to process it. One of them grabbed her arm and, with a swift turn, threw her to the ground. The second officer, without hesitation, kicked in the door of her house and stormed inside. I stood there in shock. How was this possible? She called the police on us, and now she was being arrested. What was going on? It was so absurd that my mind simply refused to accept it. I stepped closer to try to understand what was happening, and then one of the officers turned to me with the calmest smile I had ever seen. "Don't worry, sir. We're here to help," he said, as if it was just another day on the job. I didn't know whether to laugh or cry. It all looked like a scene from some dark comedy movie. But it was happening for real. The neighbor, who a minute ago was full of confidence in her righteousness, now lay on the ground, handcuffed by the police. She was charged with false reporting, and it sounded like the most absurd twist anyone could have imagined. My wife and I returned to our barbecue. The coals were almost out, but the meat could still be saved. The neighbors, who had been watching us from their windows, now peeked out from behind their curtains, unsure of what to think. The situation had turned into a circus, and I couldn't help but smirk. As I resumed grilling the meat, an idea came to me. I turned to my wife and suggested, "Let's name this dish after her. Neighborhood Grill. It'll remind us of how ridiculously life can turn upside down in an instant." We both laughed. Laughter became our way of coping with the absurdity, a way to deal with what seemed impossible. And so, under the crackling of the coals and the whispers of the neighbors, our evening continued. Who would have thought that an ordinary barbecue would turn into such a spectacle? But life is full of surprises, and sometimes the only thing you can do is laugh at its absurd twists. The day after the barbecue, I woke up with a feeling that something was wrong. The evening that was supposed to symbolize our new beginning had left a strange aftertaste. Everything seemed to have ended on a positive note. The neighbor who called the police was taken away in handcuffs, and we peacefully finished the evening. But something inside me wouldn't let go. I tried to shake off these thoughts by diving into my usual morning routine, but the sense of unease only grew stronger. And then, as I finally sat down with a cup of coffee, I noticed an envelope lying on the kitchen table. No return address. No name. Just my address. When I opened it, I found several photographs inside. The photos showed our family during yesterday's barbecue. The shots were clearly taken from someone else's yard or window. Each photo had red marker notes at the bottom, as if someone had meticulously studied our actions. There was also a newspaper clipping with the headline, "Police Violence in a Quiet Suburb." The article talked about yesterday's incident, but with a strange focus on us. Suddenly I realized someone was definitely watching us. The question was, who and why? Yesterday evening was not the end, but just the beginning of something bigger, something much more sinister. I started to suspect that our neighbors had united against us, that this wasn't just a coincidence. Something was brewing, and I needed to be prepared. The more I thought about the letter, the stronger my anxiety grew. The neighbors' looks yesterday, their whispers, all these little things began to form a single picture. They were watching us, studying our actions, and they were clearly planning something. But what? My suspicions were confirmed that evening when someone knocked on our door. It was a neighbor, a tall man with a tense expression. He introduced himself as John and said he wanted to talk about yesterday's incident. I had a feeling this wasn't just a friendly visit. We sat down in the kitchen, and I offered him a drink to ease the tension. John started with the usual questions about how we were settling into our new home, how we liked the neighborhood. But his hints and the subtext of his words made me wary. He clearly knew more than he was letting on. "You know," he said, "our neighborhood has its traditions. And, to be honest, the neighbors are a little concerned about how things went down yesterday. We don't want any trouble, you understand?" "What kind of traditions?" I asked, trying to keep my composure, though I felt a chill run down my spine. John smiled, but there was no warmth in his smile. "Usually when new people move in, we throw a little party in their honor, to get to know each other better and to make sure they understand the rules." I felt a shiver run down my spine. His tone, his expression, everything suggested that there was something much darker hidden behind the word party. As John began to describe the details of this party, I realized that this was no joke. The neighbors were planning to humiliate us, to make an example of us, to show that we didn't belong here. He talked about traditions that involved bullying and degradation, and it sounded so absurd and cruel that I didn't even know how to react. But instead of giving in to panic or anger, I decided to play along with their rules. I pretended to support his ideas, even offering a few enhancements to their plan. I suggested ways to make their party even more impressive, how to add a special touch to it. John left satisfied, not suspecting that I was about to turn their game upside down. Now I was no longer just a victim. I was becoming a player in their game, and that gave me a strange sense of satisfaction. Ahead of us was a night that could change everything, and I was determined to make sure it ended on my terms. After talking to John, I realized that the situation was more serious than it initially seemed. These people, my neighbors, weren't just trying to scare us or impose their own rules. They were planning something more sinister, something that could not only disrupt our comfort, but also break us down mentally. A sense of anxiety gripped me, but at the same time, I felt a strange thrill. There was something incredibly captivating about being at the center of this game, where the stakes were higher than I could have ever imagined. I understood that I could no longer just sit and wait for them to strike. I had to seize the initiative and force them to play by my rules. My wife and I discussed the situation, and she fully supported me. We both knew there was no turning back, and if we wanted to survive in this new reality, we needed to be as ruthless as our enemies. The first thing I did was install cameras all around the house. I wanted to see their every move, to know what they were planning. This gave me a sense of control, even if it was just an illusion. Then I started checking the locks and entrances to the house, every corner, every window. I couldn't afford the slightest mistake, but the most important thing was that I began gathering information. Through social media and mutual acquaintances, I tried to find out which of the neighbors were truly involved in this conspiracy. And the more I discovered, the clearer it became that they would stop at nothing. Once I knew enough, I met with a few friends I could trust, people who understood what was happening and were ready to help. We started discussing plans and tactics, figuring out the best way to protect ourselves. One of my friends came up with an idea that I immediately liked: counterattack. We needed to make sure the neighbors didn't see what was coming, to make them feel the same fear they were trying to impose on us. We began preparing. The house filled up with items meant to give the neighbors a false sense of security. At the same time, I set up hidden traps, cameras that recorded their every move, and alarms that warned me of approaching danger. The whole house became our fortress, and I was its commander. "They think we're afraid of them," I said to my friends during one of our meetings. "But we'll show them that we won't submit." "And how do you plan to do that?" one of them asked. "We'll throw a party they'll never forget," I replied with a grin. "We'll make them feel like fools. They expect to see scared victims, but they'll see something entirely different." At that moment, I knew I had taken the initiative from them. Now it was my game, and I was ready for its final stage. The night before the party was tense. I stayed up, checking the cameras, going over the plan, preparing for whatever might happen. My mind raced with thoughts, ranging from doubt to confidence in victory. But more than anything, I was driven by the anticipation of how our neighbors would react to what we had prepared for them. When I finally got the signal from one of my friends, who was keeping an eye on the neighbors' movements, I knew the time had come. Everything had to go perfectly. They expected to see us in fear and panic, but instead, they were greeted by a lively crowd, champagne, and fireworks. We decided to welcome them with such hospitality that they'd never expected. When the neighbors approached our house, they froze in shock. Everything was decorated, the tables were overflowing with food, and music was playing all around. We greeted them with smiles, as if they were our most cherished guests. I saw the confusion and disbelief on their faces. They didn't know what to think. This was the moment I had planned for. "Welcome to the party," I said cheerfully, handing John a glass of champagne. "We're so glad you came." They looked lost. Their plan had turned into a farce, and they had become unwilling participants in an absurd play. With each passing moment, I enjoyed the situation more and more, realizing that they no longer controlled the game. When our neighbors realized that their plan with the party had failed, I felt everything around me start to change. Up until that point, I thought it was just a random game, some kind of innocent fun. But now I saw that they had become much more aggressive, and the game had moved to a new level. This was no longer just a dispute over who was in charge of the neighborhood. It had become a struggle for survival. My wife noticed the changes before I did. She began to get nervous, noticing how the neighbors were increasingly looking at us with suspicion, how they whispered to each other as we walked by. But I felt something different. Instead of fear, I felt excitement, like an adrenaline rush before an important event. I knew they were preparing for a counterattack, and now I was ready to meet it head-on. I began to wonder who these people really were, these neighbors living behind our walls. I started digging into their lives, searching for their weaknesses, finding out what exactly they were hiding from the world. I understood that each of them had their own secrets, and I was prepared to use those secrets against them. This was no longer just defense. It was an attack. I started gathering information like a detective investigating a complex case. What helped me was that the neighbors had no idea about my activities. Outwardly, I continued to behave as a friendly neighbor, but inside, I was prepared for their every move. I knew they were watching us, and I played my role flawlessly. I began with small details. I noted who left their house when, what they brought in their bags, and who they talked to. Gradually, I started finding traces of their secrets. Dissatisfied conversations with relatives, strange visits from guests, small but significant details that they seemed to be trying to hide. And the more I discovered, the stronger my confidence grew. But the real breakthroughs came when I applied my technical knowledge to the process. I hacked into a few of their computers, gained access to their emails and personal messages. In each of them, I found something that could be used against them. They thought they were playing with us, but they didn't realize they had long since become pawns in my game. I collected this information like pieces of a mosaic, preparing for my next move. I knew they were planning something serious, but now I had a trump card. When they tried to strike again, I would be ready. The moment came when I knew the time had arrived. I gathered all the evidence, all the details of their lives, and was ready to show them that I knew everything about them. I decided to throw a new party, this time in their honor. It was meant to be not just a celebration, but a display of power, where I would use all the information I had gathered. We invited all our dear neighbors, and they came despite their inner doubts. I could see how nervous they were, how they glanced at each other, sensing that something was wrong. When everyone had gathered, I stood before them with a glass of champagne and began my speech. Dear neighbors, I began with a smile. I want to thank you for your care and attention. Lately, I feel we've grown closer than ever, and to show my appreciation, I've prepared a little surprise for you. The screen of the television lit up behind me. It was a video presentation I had prepared, using all the secrets I had managed to uncover. A mix of horror and confusion appeared on my neighbors' faces. I started showing their messages, photos, and recordings of phone conversations. Each of them saw that I knew more about them than they could have imagined. As you can see, we're all very close to each other, I said with a smile, revealing their sins one by one. And I'm sure this closeness will only make us stronger. They sat in their seats, not knowing what to do. Their faces showed fear, shame, and at the same time, anger toward me. But I was enjoying the situation. I was the master of the game, and now, this was my stage. We laughed, drank champagne, while they sat there, not knowing where to hide from the shame and humiliation. I had become the master of the game, and it was incredibly satisfying. After my party of revelations, I was convinced that I had achieved a complete victory. The neighbors looked crushed. Their fear and humiliation were evident. I relished this sense of control, confident that from now on, they would keep their distance from me and my family. But life always finds a way to strike back at the overconfident. A few days passed, and at first, everything seemed normal. I was riding the high of my little victory, certain that everything would now be just as I wanted. But gradually, I began to notice strange things. The looks that the neighbors exchanged when they saw me became more wary, but not out of fear, more out of anger. I started to feel that something was wrong, that they hadn't given up, but were preparing for something bigger. One evening, while returning home, I noticed that I was being followed. At first, it was just a car slowly trailing me down the street, then figures lurking in the shadows as I approached. My sense of security vanished as if it had never existed. I realized that they were planning a counterattack, and this time, they wouldn't stop at anything. The more I thought about what was happening, the clearer it became that I wasn't ready for what might come next. My victory at the party was just the beginning of a new, more brutal game. They had decided to take action, and I felt that the time for jokes was over. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had a strange feeling that something was about to happen, and my fears were confirmed when I heard suspicious sounds outside the window. It was a dull noise, unmistakable. My heart skipped a beat. I went to the window and carefully cracked it open. In the darkness, I saw several masked figures stealthily approaching our house. They moved in unison and silently, clearly preparing for something serious. My fear turned into icy terror. They were about to break into the house, and I knew this wasn't just another attempt to scare us. I understood that they intended to use force. I couldn't afford to panic. My family depended on me. I woke up my wife and children, telling them not to make a sound. We descended to the basement, which was set up as a safe place for emergencies. Each second felt like an eternity. We could hear them breaking down the doors, shouting, and I realized that this time, things might not go according to plan. Once in the basement, I tried to keep my composure. Hundreds of thoughts raced through my mind about how to protect my family and survive this situation. But when I heard them coming down the stairs, my heart froze. This was the moment of truth. Everything I had done before now seemed so insignificant. A critical moment had arrived, and I realized that from here on out, things would only get worse. When they finally burst into the basement, I was prepared for the worst, but what happened next surpassed all my expectations. Instead of finding us in fear and panic, they stumbled upon massive piles of teddy bears scattered across the floor. In the darkness and chaos, they didn't immediately grasp what had happened. Their faces showed utter confusion. I couldn't help but laugh. This was the final joke I had prepared, knowing they would try to intimidate us. They stood in the middle of this absurd scene, not knowing what to do, when I pressed a button that activated sirens and bright lights. The basement was filled with noise and light, and the entire farce became even more ridiculous. They tried to get their bearings, to understand what was happening, while I simply enjoyed the situation. In that moment, I realized just how absurd this entire game had become. This was my counterattack, but not the one they expected. I left them with their fears and humiliation, understanding that now I controlled not only their fears, but the very reality in which we all found ourselves. After I fought off the last attack, I was certain that this nightmare was finally over. All the threats, assaults, and provocations were supposed to be behind us. But the internal tension that had been building up inside me didn't dissipate. Something had changed in the neighbors' behavior. They no longer looked at us with contempt and malice. Their gazes had become wary and quiet. It was strange, and I couldn't put my finger on what exactly had shifted. Then, one day, I received a letter. It wasn't like the ones I'd found before, no threats or ultimatums. Just a few words, written in neat handwriting. The game isn't over. This message gave me a strange feeling. Someone else had intervened in our conflict. Someone who might have been watching everything from the sidelines. I didn't understand what it meant, but one thing was clear. The game was still on, and its rules might have changed. From that moment on, strange things began happening in my life. At first, it was small stuff. Doors left ajar, odd phone calls with no one on the other end, silhouettes flickering in the windows. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to paranoia, but the sense that I was being watched was too strong to dismiss. Now I knew someone was monitoring my every move, and it made me even more alert. I tried to live as before, but every day felt like walking through a minefield. Gradually, I began noticing more details that confirmed my suspicions. It seemed that someone among my neighbors had connected with someone more powerful than just a group of disgruntled residents. I felt everything around me start to change, as if reality itself was beginning to spin in a different direction. My actions became more restrained. I no longer wanted to confront anyone directly, not knowing who I was dealing with. Each day brought new surprises. Someone left strange notes on my doorstep, and I received calls where no one would speak. This was a new game, one I didn't want to play, but was forced to. I began suspecting everyone. Every face in the window seemed menacing, every shadow threatening. And at some point, I realized that I was being watched by an entire organization. Not just a simple group of neighbors, but something bigger, something that went beyond our quiet suburban neighborhood. But what this organization was, and what their goals were, I couldn't fathom. I felt like I was caught in a web with no way out. All my fears and anxieties peaked when I started receiving new notes, but these were different. This time, they weren't threats written by adults. They were notes with threats written in childish handwriting. One of them had a drawing depicting me as a villain from some children's cartoon, and another had a threat like, "We're gonna catch you." I had no idea how to react to this. It turned out that this organization, watching me and sending threats, was a gang of kids, children from our neighborhood, inspired by all the drama, had decided to take matters into their own hands. They started spying on me, conducting their investigations to expose me. These little spies filled my life with an absurd nightmare that was both ridiculous and frightening. I couldn't help but laugh, watching them try to act like grown-up villains, not realizing that this was all just a childish game. But despite that, the sense of absurdity and surrealism only grew stronger. I found myself at the center of a ridiculous game, where kids played detectives and adults were the villains. Yet somehow, it all became a reality. Waking up this morning, I felt an odd sense of relief. It seemed like the nightmare I had endured over the past few weeks had been nothing more than a bad dream. Gradually, I began to realize that it had indeed happened, but the feeling of unreality clung to me. Everything seemed too quiet, too normal. I sat on the edge of the bed, trying to calm the thoughts that surged through my mind like waves crashing on the shore. Could it really be over? Could I finally return to a normal life? But as soon as I got up and headed to the bathroom to wash my face, everything changed. I saw it, a small note on the mirror, impossible to miss. Just 3 words, "Welcome back." My heart started to race, and a wave of anxiety rose in my chest. What did it mean? Who left it? I looked back on my life, at all the events that had brought me to this point, and realized this wasn't over. All this time, I had thought I was in control, that I was playing by my own rules. But now, it was clear that I was just a puppet in someone else's more complex game. From the day I found that note, my life began to resemble a strange play in which I was both the main character and a spectator. Every day I found new clues, as if someone was deliberately leaving them to guide me in a certain direction. These were odd things, small details that seemed random, but each pointed to something larger. I tried to return to normal life, but it was impossible. All these little signs, like scars, reminded me that the game was still on. Unlocked doors, strange calls, faces glimpsed in windows. All of it made me feel like I wasn't living in reality, but existing in someone's twisted fantasy. Sometimes it felt like someone was writing the script of my life, and I was merely acting out the roles they assigned me. This must be some kind of mistake, I kept telling myself, but the more I tried to convince myself, the clearer it became that it wasn't. Each new day brought more evidence that my life was something more than just a random series of events. It was a carefully planned plot, and I had no idea who the author was. One day, I decided to take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping to clear my head and rid myself of these obsessive thoughts. But instead of finding peace, I encountered her, the woman who had started it all. She stood by the window of a cafe, looking at me with an expression I couldn't read. "You're still in the game," she said as I approached. "And now you have to make a choice." Her voice was calm, but there was a strange confidence in it, as if she knew more than I could imagine. "What choice?" I asked, not understanding where she was going. "With this. You can stay in this reality," she replied, "or return to your former life. But if you choose the latter, your life will never be the same." I stood before her, feeling 1,000 questions forming in my mind. What did she mean by former life? Why did I have to choose? But something clicked inside me. I realized that this choice wasn't real. Whatever I chose, I would still remain in the game. And then I did the only thing that seemed right. "I'm staying," I said firmly, feeling a strange sense of calm. She nodded, as if she had expected this answer. "Good luck," she said, taking a step back. "Maybe next time you'll play better." Her words sounded like a taunt, but I knew she was right. All of this was just the beginning of an even more insane game. I walked away with a smile, knowing that now I would enjoy every moment of this absurdity. Because now I understood that my life was nothing more than a continuous performance, one that I would continue to play, regardless of my desires.